and welcome to this episode of Oral History of Evidence Synthesis and Automation of Evidence Synthesis and Systematic Reviews. These two series document the developments, including the technological developments in our field, in conversation with the science and tech leaders. We are documenting the past, present, and the futures for all generations of evidence synthesizers or systematic reviewers. Our guest today is John Brassey, and many of you would know that he's the guy who funded TRIP database, which is probably the most used evidence-based medicine source in the world since the inception. So John, welcome, and please tell all about yourself to the audience and who you are and how you get into the idea of starting TRIP database.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you. Even though we met up again last week, we keep bumping into each other, which is nice, at the Search Solutions conference. What about me? I've been knocking around for years now in the evidence-based medicine field. I did a science degree back in 1987 to 1991. I then went into the NHS, started work in Bristol, where I live now. Uh, and I did some post-grad work in a lab. And then I fell into the world of clinical audit, which links to quality of care. And from there, I went to the Regional Health Authority in the southwest of England, where I was involved in the phrase then was clinical effectiveness. That in my head, it's perhaps not strictly true, but in my head, clinical effectiveness predated evidence-based medicine, but they probably evolved around the same time. And from clinical effectiveness project manager or some title like that, I went to Gwent Health Authority, where my role there was where I suppose the TRIP journey started, because the term TRIP stood for Turning Research into Practice. And it was while I was at Gwent Health Authority, the overarching themes of clinical effectiveness in the time were we've got to teach the doctors to search for themselves and to critically appraise for themselves. I spoke to over 200 GPs in Gwent. There was about 330 at the time,
Yeah.
so well over half. And none of them wanted search skills. None of them wanted critical appraisal skills. They just wanted someone to answer their question.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is a theme that will come up time and time again, is there's often a disconnect between what we'd like people to do and what they are able or willing to do. And so you could send them the GPs on these training courses, but the vast majority of them wouldn't do it. They would use their existing systems to answer clinical questions, which was typically ask a colleague. It probably still is the main way doctors and health professionals get answers to their clinical uncertainties. Uh, so it was an overwhelming thing of answer our questions. And so I was trying to be good. I was not a trained information specialist. So I got them to send me their clinical questions. We had a little leaflet and they used to be able to post them, or they used to be able to send them via fax to me. So this is, as I say, this was probably 1996, 97. And then I would try and find the answer for them. And so this predated Google. And so there were a few EBM sites, such as Cochrane. Cochrane was around then. Sign was around then. Prodigy was around then. And there was about 20 evidence-based sites. And so the idea was I would go from so question came in on heart failure. I would go to one site, another site, any any articles that might answer this question. If there was, I'd click on the hyperlink. If there was a hyperlink, again, this is years ago, and often it was just the URL that you pasted into the browser. And then I would try and answer it. And if that was no good, I then used to go to Medline, which is on 6 CD-ROMs. It was on a CD. I don't know if you ever came
Yeah.
across one, but it's like,
There was a tower of them, so you have to put like,
six. Yeah. So this was a real long-winded process. And it just made sense to me to have uh, all the links to the high quality content, the Cochrane and the Sign, in one place. And so I started a spreadsheet. So I went to Sign and recorded all titles and URLs in the spreadsheet. Ditto Cochrane. So Cochrane was nowhere near as big as it is now. And ditto for all the other sources. So I had a database of 1,000, 1,500 hyperlinks, articles and hyperlinks. And so if a question came in on heart failure, I'd use the find function in Excel and say, oh, that looks plausible. And that was Trip is still based uh, every month. I will upload new content. We automate now. We'll perhaps touch upon this later. But see, we still use a spreadsheet, or I still use a spreadsheet every month to update content and upload it to the site. But this was before we had the website, and I just happened. So this is where I was working for Gwent Health Authority,
What year is this now?
97,
Mm.
1997. So 27 years ago. No idea when the whenabouts in the year it was. These things, it's like you don't know at the time that something that you're creating will be, which will last so long, and so you just do it, see what when you're young as well. I was then. It was like you just try these things and you see what happens, and so yeah, I just bumped into someone over the corridor, and this was when the internet was sort of starting to take off, and it was deemed, oh, we should have a website. Okay, so let's create a website. Bumped into a guy of, can you make this searchable? Oh yeah, yeah, I can make it searchable. And it was just a title, it was a keyword, very simple keyword in the title search. And that's how Trip started. I put it out on the EBM mail list, which is still going, the evidence-based, I think it's the evidence-based healthcare, one of the JISC ones. And
Yeah.
it became a bit well known. And then Bandolier. Bandolier was a really great journal magazine. I don't know what you'd
Yes,
even describe it
pity,
as.
pity. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was from Oxford, so people like Muir Gray were involved in funding that, and they liked it, and they praised it, and that was very nice for me to hear. It was obviously nice for my ego, and that's the sort of thing, you know, it's flattering when people pay you attention. And it was very nice when I was starting out in my career to have such praise. But also it made it obvious that other people found it useful. And it was useful
Absolutely.
not just for me for making my life, it was there to help. Initially, it was there to help make my life easier by speeding up the question answering process. And then it became more useful or it became apparent that other people found it useful, and therefore I continue to develop it in tandem with my work, and it's developed ever since. But it's important to understand that it's at its heart, it is a tool. It initially started, it's mutated to be fair, but it initially started as a tool to support health professionals answer their clinical questions. That's how I always see it. There's things we could do which would make it better, which again we'll touch upon possibly. But it's so it's not like a Medline, which is and again you probably know the correct terminology, but I wouldn't, it's not a bibliographic database. It's not meant to be exhaustive. We could easily include all of PubMed in Trip, but our users don't want it. If they wanted to search PubMed, they'd search PubMed. And so what we want to do, our ethos is quality, not quantity. The evidence pyramid principle is ingrained in Trip, and that's an important part of it. So that's,
Yes.
in a nutshell, how we got to where we are now. Started in the health service, that did Q&A, and it's grown because people have used it in huge numbers over the years. We've been searched hundreds of millions of times, and it's and so, when we ask people, they love it. They don't love paying for it, but that's the nature. That's the nature of the beast, really. But it's we'll touch upon that. The commercial side of it later on, I'm sure. But it's that's how it started. Help me answer clinical questions.
Well, there are a couple of points for the audience. The first is that they probably are using Excel on daily basis. None of them thinks that such a great source would have started with Excel spreadsheet. And the second thing that you mentioned about I asked the clinicians how they are managing their clinical questions. And if they want to actually learn searching and critical appraisal. So what we did a study in emergency department, and we asked people, what do you do with your clinical questions? We were doing a study on personal information management. So what they do with their clinical question is emergency department, they are busy. And I think the fourth most frequent answer was forgetting. They were actually forgetting their questions because they said that at the time that we are dealing with patient, we don't have time to find it, and there is no time to record it. So we just simply forget it. And the next time that we face it again, we said that, oh, I already had the chance to find that, but I forgot it because you get busy with life and all of that. So it is valuable to have these sources at the care point when doctors need it, and they actually don't have time to go through the hundreds of results in Google or PubMed. They just want something rapid. They want a single document. They don't want 100. They don't have time to do systematic review or meta-analysis or any sort of synthesis. So it is a valuable source. And you already answered a lot of questions, I think. But I wanted to directly ask this from you again. That did you just say that Trip database was older than Google?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, it is a very important point for the audience that Google might have gotten the idea from Trip database.
Ha.
I'm just joking, but you also mentioned about the content. So this is one of the confusing part for the people who want to classify trip database, and they usually tell people don't do that. We are in now postmodern world that you couldn't classify things. I mean, PubMed has got features that does not exist in Medline. We don't know what to call PubMed now because it is not Medline. It's got other features that are not usually for the bibliographic databases. So is Trip actually a database with its own content that is gathered from other sources, curated and kept within your databases? So if something happens to PubMed, you still have the content. Or is it just a search engine that gets the, like aggregator, gets the information from the other places and it has no text, image, or video for its own?
Okay, this requires a bit of explaining about how our search works.
Yeah.
We don't produce, well, we don't really produce much content ourselves. And so we link out, just like Google. Google links out to documents. We link out to documents. We link out to other people's documents as to Google. But for search to work, we have to do something called indexing. And so what we do, we use an open source piece of software called Solar. It's linked with another piece of software called Lucene. And what we do is we upload the URL. Well, briefly, we upload the year of publication, the title of the document, and the URL. Then what happens is we send a spider off to the URL. That grabs the text. The text is then indexed within Solar. So if you're doing a full text search, it searches the index in Solar. It doesn't search the document on the web. And then we produce the search results. The user clicks on the title and that takes them to the document on the internet, not within our Solar. We don't reproduce the content within Trip. We have something called a snippet, but that's just a small piece of, a couple of paragraphs to help orientate the user.
Okay, I see. So, do you do any other curation like coding, like extracting Pico information or something like that, automatically or manually to make sure that the content presented has got some human input?
There's no human input really. We do things, and we're going to obviously, and again, we might come on to this. We're looking to how we can use LLMs to improve the situation. But currently, what we do, as documents come in, we tag them by clinical areas, and so the document says cholesterol in the elderly. we will know that cholesterol is linked to cardiovascular system or the cardiovascular diseases, and the elderly is geriatrics. And so we'd manually tag that. So that's again done just by word matching. It's very
Okay.
simple, but it's pretty effective. And so we do simple things like that. We do some sort of basic tagging like that. And there is the potential to improve that dramatically.
I
But we'll
see.
see.
And who funds Trip database? How did you start like funding it as a website, as a search engine? It would require a bit of resources. I know that first it was just your time and the spreadsheet, but then you moved online.
Well,
Yeah.
this is when I was working within the NHS, and so it was an NHS site to start with. But then when I left my job, they took the website down almost
Uh,
instantly. So I then had to recreate it. And then, but what I this is genuinely, I do not remember how we funded the website when we put it onto the URL tripdatabase.com. I think it wasn't very much money because we were working with a small startup web
mhm.
company in Cardiff, and it was probably I suspect I put some of my own money in, but again, I'm not sure.
It wasn't much then,
It was very
because if it was
simple.
much, you would remember.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was much simpler than it is now. To do that now, it would not be possible. But in it, back then, it might have had text search as opposed to just title word search, but it was pretty crude and it didn't have much content. It wasn't on Sol, it was on a sort of something like SQL or so. I don't know. So it was all put together with the real bare amount of money. And then I think it was from that we just used to go. Well, I used to go to um, essentially beg for money. And I remember once this company wanted to use our content, and this was again, this was probably early 2000s. And he said, how much do you want so he could reuse the content? I made some ridiculous figure in my head because again, I was young, I wasn't used to money and stuff like that, or relatively young. And it was like I put this figure which was like it was five figures, mid five figures. And I'd have been happy with like I think I asked for 50. No, I asked for not no, I was happy with 5,000. I asked for 96,000 and ended up with 50,000. And that was and I was just delighted. I couldn't believe it. And yeah, if he's watching this, he'll be upset. But anyway, it was a long time ago. But you know, that gave us a firm footing, and we continued to contract with this company for another 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer. But we also did some other stuff with them around, you know, doing bespoke Q&A. They had a portal with which doctors were part of, and so they asked us questions. That all added to the sort of the bank balance of Trip. But then towards this is now 2012, 2013. I was worried every December because the renewal was January. So I was saying if the money goes, we're that's it. I knew they weren't using the content effectively, and so I thought we had to move to it, it was a huge amount of stress for me, and I thought I can't be doing with this, and so I had to look around and find another business model. And that's how we arrived at the freemium business model.
Hmm.
Most of it would be free, but for those who would pay, they could get extra content and extra functionality. And it was like it's something I hate having to do. But it's, you know, I could either close the site or continue the site. It was to me, it was that simple.
Yes, that is the question of sustainability. And I remember that once you wrote a blog like 4 or 5 years ago. It was about getting a funding from, was it K Connect, that was supposed to be used for automating pico extraction or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that yeah, we pick up the occasional pockets of money. We still do some Q&A for some groups. We do some rapid reviews. But this K Connect, this was an EU funded project. Oh, it's interesting because I hate filling in forms and doing, that's why I don't apply for many. When your success rate of applying for a grant is sort of 10%, I don't like those odds. And but with K Connect, I was approached by the lead academic, and he just wanted two sides of A4 of my ideas, and that was all I had to write. And I got the funding was generous in the respect of it was there to do the automation. We didn't make a great, it paid for some of my time, but it wasn't as though, oh, we had this grant and oh, that's all profit. It was
Mm.
okay, we got say we got £10,000 for a bit of natural language processing, saying extracting the Pico elements from document titles. That wouldn't have made a profit for Trip. That would have gone and paid for the person doing the natural language
Yeah,
processing. And so there was
yeah,
a bit of my time was paid for to a small extent.
yeah. So right now, any developments that happens in Trip is actually funded by the subscription that are being, which is a sustainable model. I think people still like it, even though many people want everything for free. But it seems inevitable that at some point you have to be pragmatic about funding and sustaining what you've created.
Absolutely. And I think it would be nice if I was a multimillionaire and didn't need to charge people. But it's that's not the case. And I don't want to take money from pharma. Uh, and the government equally. It's very difficult. We are very happy that we're independent of other people, and that independence comes at a, you know, it means that yeah, we have to have. I know when we had introduced freemium. A lot of people were really disappointed, and that was perhaps a communication thing that people didn't realise that actually I'm not paying for Trip myself. It's expensive to maintain.
It is.
And it's like there's a sort of that needs money coming in, and I haven't got enough money to self-fund it, and it's ridiculous to think that that could be the case. But as you say, people like things for free. But for anybody who set, I talk to people all the time about project they're doing, and sustainability is a real key issue. You know, I've got this product, the product's invariably great, uh, but they can't sustain it. And you think, well, okay, that's having a great idea is probably the easiest thing. It's making it is operationalizing it and then
Yeah.
making sustainable is, well, for me, ideas are really easy for me. Some of them are all right, some of them are terrible. But ideas are very easy. But it's then making it a product that's viable is the real trick.
That's that was a good lesson to learn because I think many of us have got great ideas, but then we are busy with 9 to 5 jobs, and then you need funding. And I mean, you started within NHS, and NHS later created something called NHS Evidence, which at some point I think it was really popular, but then it disappeared and made many people upset. And that is what happens when there is no sustainable funding coming, and then the management team has to make a pragmatic decision on which one to let go of. And so I think it is understandable the decision about the triptych. I don't think many people complain now because I remember that it was about 14 or 16 years ago that you emailed me asking about what's your opinion about freemium, and I said that I think it is good as long as people have access to the life-saving features. Now they have access to the life-saving part because I mean they couldn't filter by country for the guidelines, for example, but they could still run a search and find the documents that they want. They could still see the level of the evidence. So I think it is still making a big difference. And there is a major question that actually I had a conversation last week with one of my colleagues said that all of this started happening in 1990s. Why? Why it started all of these EBM, Cochrane, Tree database, all of these noises started in 1990s. Do you have any idea what happened in that decade?
Well, I think the simple, again, I'm not a historian, I'm not a sociologist. Uh, but my take on this is you had people like David Sackett. and Ian Chalmers and Muir Gray in Oxford. I didn't particularly know Dave Sackett, but I knew Muir Gray, or know Muir Gray and Ian Chalmers. They're both really charismatic, and they both are very good at getting people to work for them for nothing. And I think people recognize the brilliance of them, and they were happy. They were convinced by the message that we need to have high quality evidence to guide clinical practice policy. And so I think it just, I think there was this the creation of the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine, Bandolier, all that was happening out of Oxford. There's lots of other centres there's a Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in North America, I forget where, but I think to me, it starts with Cochrane around Oxford in that era, because I think Cochrane's a bit older than Tripp, 2 or 3 years. So for me, this was happening, this notion of clinical effectiveness, evidence-based medicine was percolating through the NHS with an interesting quality. And I just happened to be the NHS, and I just happened to be perhaps an early adopter of this message that was coming out of Oxford, and happened because I'm lazy. I wanted my life to be easier with Q&A, and so I happened to make the product. It was liked by Bandolier, and my ego got inflamed, and that was it really. So for me, it was like I was on the coattails of the greats of Oxford, really.
And yes, I think McMaster, Oxford, Johns Hopkins, these were the centers over, and Bond actually in Australia,
Mm.
not to miss. And so Tripp is one of the oldest kids in the block, and actually survived. It's an admirable and life-saving source. However, many wonder how it survived while the search engines, the great ones such as Alta Vista, disappeared. NHS Evidence, Bandolier. What is the secret behind this survival, and what is the secret to pass on to the other people who are thinking about creating online sources in healthcare?
That's a really complicated question, really difficult. So you might have to prod me later on to come back to bits I might miss. I think Alta Vista is a different kettle of fish. It was a sort of mainstream thing that got squeezed out by the likes of Google, because Google was better. Uh, Bandolier was funded from the NHS, and so the NHS is fickle, and so it funds you one day, it won't fund you another, and they just ran out of funding, and which was a great shame, because people, the doctors I used to see used to love it, and but again, it was like the money men, women didn't want to fund it. Things like NHS Evidence was ridiculously expensive. I fell out with them because I heard that NHS Evidence was on its way, and in my mind, it was basically a Tripp clone, and it wasn't much different. And I was livid because what I wanted, more so back then, was I wanted NHS Evidence to be 10 times better than Tripp, so I could learn from them to help me to make Tripp better. But it came out, and I thought, this is disappointing. It's to me, it was not special. And so again, this is a tip, cause trouble. I was encouraged. Two of the great people I've worked with have always encouraged me to be a troublemaker. The last person was Ian Chalmers. I remember seeing Ian probably about 15 years ago, and I said, "Oh, Ian, I'm learning to behave myself." And he told me I was doing myself a disservice. And so I think so. It's helped me by I've picked fights with uh, NICE and Cochrane in the past, and with NICE, I did a series of freedom of information requests saying how much does NHS evidence cost, because it was hidden, and it was £10 million. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. They had a huge team to produce NHS evidence, and they were really unhappy with me because I dared to ask how much was this costing. And so that was, and so I think they weren't generating for the amount of money that was going into it. The return was obviously they didn't feel it was value for money. And, also, I think it also wasn't core to NICE's general function. And so that's why, uh, I'm guessing that's why it was mothballed. But then jumping from that, you asked about how can people, if people have got a good idea, how can they do it? You've got to love it. You've got to have a passion for it. Passion will take you a long way. I always remember talking to a librarian, and he'd done something on a spreadsheet. Nothing to do with what a trip sort of thing, but he had done I even forget what it was, but I remember it was on a spreadsheet. He was very proud of it, and it's invariably very, very useful.
It
But
was
he
a
says,
search
"Well,
strategy, designing search strategy.
I'm not genuinely just can't
Yeah.
remember. This was going." And he says, "Why aren't the doctors using it?" And I said, "For the doctors to use it, it's got to be better than Google. Is it better than Google? No. When why on earth would they? And you could ask the question now is, you might have a brilliant idea, but the thing is, you've got to understand your user, and your user doesn't want to. Your user is used to going to Google and will bookmark a few things, Medline, trip, whatever." And you've got to do something really special for them to bookmark it and to remember to go to it. I'm sure you've come across loads of websites which are quite exciting, and you might bookmark 70% of them, 20% of them, I don't know. But then 6 months down the line, you think, I wonder where that website was. And you can't remember it to find it. So there's all these issues of the user acceptance of the tool you make. And so for this librarian, it's like, you ain't better than Google. It's unlikely you're going to get much traction on this. And so there's part of that. You've got to understand the user. You've got to love what you're doing to be prepared to push it. You've got to get a bit lucky, and obviously funding is is desirable, but you can get a long way with not much money.
Yes, if you love something, you will spend your time or money or both sometimes on it, and you will be satisfied. Yes, it's a good point. And the fact that you mentioned about being a troublemaker, it has come up in other interviews as well. So maybe I should title this one John Brassey, the troublemaker.
Well, I see it. I see it. There's lots of people playing. There's lots of people in this wanting to make a success of things. And I used to work for the NHS, don't anymore. And there was a career route that you went in the NHS to, you played the game, you did well, you did what, and you didn't rock the boat. And if you're lucky, you'd be better than the other people who were also swimming in the same, and you would get the promotion. I never liked the odds. And I thought, well, I'm just gonna do it my way. And, you know, I and so I just sort of thought I've got nothing to lose. And I genuinely felt both times that I've fallen out with sort of big groups, I felt I had a point. And again, I might be just being an idiot. As I was prepared to stand up for what I felt was an important point. Again, this comes back to passion and caring about stuff. And and yeah, I think I circumvented the usual promotion route. Well, I didn't get very far in the NHS really, so I just left because my route has been trip really, I suppose. By putting my head above the parapet, my profile was raised significantly, and and that helped me. It wasn't intentional. It just that's I look back now, trying to make sense of it all, and why was I so cavalier? Again, youth, I guess, at the time, but it was it's who knows.
You got tripped by trip.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, the one thing that crosses the mind with the NHS and the initiatives that they start is that NHS involves a lot of bureaucracy, and to get things done, you need to involve more people because of the bureaucracy, and it increases the costs. And then later, these people resist to get rid of this bureaucracy because it would mean losing their jobs or getting transferred to something new, because people get used to what they are doing. So it is understandable that it is slightly hard in a system such as NHS, which is great for treating people, diagnosing and treating people. But when it comes to the innovation, it requires a fast moving structure, and fast moving means less bureaucracy, more pragmatism. So it's understandable that some of the initiatives that they had didn't end, but we learned from it, and I think all of us, whoever is trying to start a new source or promote a new source that already exists, develop it. I think there are lessons in here to learn, that you need to be passionate about it. You need to spend your time, and then you need to know your user, because without that, whatever you are doing is a personal project. Um, but also, Trip, do people actually use it only for searching for answers for the clinical question? So they find the document, or because I've seen some people use it for the systematic reviews, like they do a search really there and report it that we searched through database and got these guidelines or these documents. Do you actually recommend people using TRIP database as a source for systematic reviews, or do you think its best use is only for the evidence-based practice?
I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to ask in a way because I'm not a methodologist. Well, I'm not a methodologist, I just collect these resources. How I see Trip. Trip is it always used to be 70, historically it was 70/30, 70% health professionals, 30% information specialists. It's now moving and more information specialists are using Trip than before. Uh, I I remember I was advising a large publishing house in America. They were doing a rapid review system. And I said, you should be using guidelines, you should be using other secondary evidence. I said, because what they were doing is they were trying to effectively help uh, health professionals search Medline and I think possibly Embase to answer their review question. And I said, I'd be really annoyed if I did this, spent 6 months, 3 months, 3 weeks, whatever it was, and found out there was a guideline or a recent document from AHRQ or NICE who answered that question. And I said, if you start searching with the primary literature, you're missing out on a lot of work that other people might have done. And so for me, I think it's very useful as you start a review to have a look at what else is out there. Because PubMed has many systematic reviews, TRIP has many, many more systematic reviews, TRIP has a load more guidelines, a load more secondary evidence, a load more regulatory guidance than PubMed has, or Embase. Again, Embase and PubMed are typically primary literature journal articles, and they tend to be lower down the evidence pyramid. You could argue about systematic reviews, that they span both, I suppose. But so Trip has a unique content, most of it grey, that is of high quality. Because if you're interested in quality, you ain't going to find it necessarily in PubMed or Medline. I use them interchangeably. I know it's lazy. Or Embase. They're not the high quality content. So what do you want? Quantity or quality? To me, you start off with a high quality, and again, if you're doing a systematic review and you find that the AHRQ have done, or IQWiG or NICE, you take your pick, have done one 2 years ago. That's a really good foundation for starting your own systematic review. You can look at what documents they use. You can do document analysis. You can, if they've got their search strategy, you can use that to inform your own search strategy. So to me, I think it's a great way of starting off the review process because you see what other people have done. And then from there, you use that as a foundation to do your own systematic review or guideline or rapid review or whatever. So I don't think it's to be used in the same way as Medline or Embase or any of those. That's how I see it. But again, that's just my perspective.
It is much better than reinventing the wheel, as you referred to. So I think many people are doing that. Actually, I remember getting a personal subscription to Trip database because of a project we had with NICE. I got 1 month subscription. I did the job and then canceled my subscription because I thought yeah, it was very complicated to go through the organizational way to get the subscription. So I thought
Mm.
that I would pay the subscription. It is quite cheap. I will get the work done. And I really loved it because there was no other source that I was aware of to have this collection of guidelines, even though some of the links were broken because one of the major guideline sources, guidelines.gov, disappeared. I don't know if Trip actually updates when they disappear. What happens to the record in Trip when the guideline source disappears?
Well, if you take the example of guideline.gov, we knew it was disappearing, and guideline.gov started, well, they had a list of their guideline producers that they included. And so we just went to their websites, the individual websites, and started recording the guidelines directly, as opposed to the guideline.gov summary. Guideline.gov was problematic as it took months to summarize the guidelines, and they only summarized a relatively small number of total guidelines. So in a way, by concentrating on guidelines.gov, it was less useful, and although now clearly a lot more work to go to the hundreds of American publishers looking for guidelines. And also when guidelines.gov went down, we tried our best. Is it the Internet Archive?
Yes.
There's a lot of them in Internet Archive, which we linked to where we could. Uh, but it was, yeah, when things like that happen, it's just really, you just think, oh no, this is going to be an awful lot of work to try and make this good. And so,
Yeah, that's why I was asking that, that do you take a copy of this content in case they disappear? And you just mentioned that no, you're just linking out.
no, we just link out.
And
The full
are
text will be in
there?
the index, but we can't reproduce it. It's not in a format that's
Oh,
reproducible as such.
I see. Are there any automation features in Trip database that people are not aware of, or they will be excited to know about? I know that many like to see short videos of the automation features. I know that you have implemented auto risk of bias assessment for the RCTs, which is robot reviewer, and I think you are using machine learning. But Trip also uses large language models, and I got the information recently. And LLM is the cool kid now. And are you using any AI, ML, LLM, RAGs automation features in Trip that people should be aware of?
Nothing major. We're testing using LLMs to create evidence summaries. A sort of like it's not like to call it like Bandolier is ridiculous, but it's sort of take the top primary care articles or the most newsworthy primary care articles from mainly the grey literature and create a summary like a journal, sort of 15 to 20 articles. And we're using LLM to summarize that. That's semi-automatic. If it takes off, we can, if people like it, we could make it for cardiology, oncology, rheumatology, blah, blah, blah. And we could make it fully automatic because a lot of this stuff is fully automatic or potential for it. But we're spending an awful lot of work in the background using LLMs. Because again, one thing that when you've been around as long as I have, you start to become more understanding of the user, I guess, but also to be led by them. Because for years I used to see a new bit of tech, Google had introduced a new feature, or there'd be at some nerdy conference and someone had mentioned something. I think, oh, that technology is brilliant. We've got to use it on Trip. And that to me, I've come to learn from my perspective anyway, is not the right way forward. You shouldn't be led by the technology. You should be led by the problem. What is the problem you are trying to solve, which this piece of kit can help you with? Because it's and so LLM's amazing technology. It shouldn't be about how can we leverage LLMs into Trip, as in the LLM shouldn't lead it. It should be what problems do the users of Trip have that an LLM might help with. And so that's the way we try to think about things now. How do we link, if we aren't wanting to introduce new technology, how can we link it to problems our users have? And so that's, you might say there's not much difference, but to me, it's a huge difference. But I think there's a another important thing that, again, what I keep coming back to the users, and this might be why Trip is successful, is that we understand well, we don't understand them. We have a reasonable understanding of many of our users and why they use Trip. But also we ask them about the use of LLMs in Trip. And they are very, very, very cautious. They don't want it to be forced upon them. And so, which is completely understandable.
Yeah.
And so we've got to chart a path through the various problems our users face, their willingness to accept the use of this technology, also their ability to not use this technology. And so it might be we won't use it by default if we're improving the search functionality, for instance. They can call it as opposed to, we push it. So push pull, I guess. But I think
Mm.
again, if we go back to the LLM thing, there are two main areas we're interested in. One is around the automated synthesis, that sort of thing, because you mentioned the K-Connect work. We did a lot of work then on automated synthesis of trials. With LLMs, we could do it much better, much more cheaply. So that's one side of things. But one of the things I did come to realize, spending all this time picking fights with people about rapid reviews and things like this, it was taking me away from doing search. And it was sort of self-indulgent in a way. I loved it. I personally found it very interesting, but it wasn't a thing. It wasn't about people coming to Trip searching. It was doing it because I enjoyed it. And I still enjoy it, it was, there's only effectively I drive Trip. I'm the only employee of Trip. And so there's not much, the brain powers, it's not completely, but I drive the ideas mainly, helped by a huge number of people who are very happy to point out if we do something badly, but they're also very happy to point out when we could do things, if there's a new feature. So I suppose what I'm saying is we've got a good user base, and the user base is very good for feedback, and we like to listen to that. But people come to us to search, and it's we've tried various features over the years that have taken us a bit away from search, and they tend to fall flat because people see Trip as a search tool, a search engine. They don't see it as bells and whistles. They don't want the bells and whistles. They want to search. And so a lot of the LLM stuff we're doing now is how can we improve the search experience? How can we leverage LLMs? And there's loads of great things we're playing around with in the background about LLMs, which could be wonderful, could be terrible. You don't know. I look at it from my perspective and think this is really clever.
Um,
Whether it
and
is, it's the users will judge.
and the evidence summary that you mentioned, is it sort of the current awareness service that people receive the, let's say, papers relevant to them in their inbox? Like, is it sort of like that, or is it something different?
I suppose it's at the moment it's not linked in. Well, it's like a current awareness service in the fact that it summarizes key documents relevant, in this case, just to primary care. At Trip at the moment, users can record their clinical areas and keywords of interest, and we email them with links to the latest content. Albeit, if so, they say they're interested in vitamin D. They click on the vitamin D link, and it takes you to a search of Trip for vitamin D for the latest content, as in that month, or
Mm.
schizophrenia or whatever. but also things like cardiology. So we do, again, what I mentioned earlier, we tag documents. And so if people say they're interested in cardiology, they can link to see the latest cardiology. But this just comes up as a set of search results. It's quite basic. And this approach of using an LLM to create sort of like a magazine, a bandolier style thingy, is our approach to improving the experience for our user. We're trying it with primary care, and we've got to ascertain if our users are enjoying it. And so we link to it from each monthly email, and we will have a look. We'll invariably keep it going for at least 6 months, see if the users like it. We'll ask them. We'll look at the web traffic, and if they do, we could well expand it. And I remember when we first did it, someone said, "Oh, could you do it personalized?" So instead of doing it by primary care, cardiology, oncology, could you start to learn what documents I like? And I thought, well, that's quite interesting, personalized newsletters or current awareness, but that's a long way away.
Yeah, so it is a subcategory of current awareness service. We call it selective dissemination of information, or SDI. So CAS and then SDI, and I think many people are finding it useful because I'm using a few of these services, and I think it is helpful for busy clinicians if they receive this in Sunday morning and they are drinking coffee and they get the link to this literature. I think it is very helpful, and they would appreciate it.
Well, my
Um,
my business partner is a general practitioner, uh, and so what happens is I manually tag the secondary evidence articles on the primary. As I do the spreadsheet, I will tag documents which I feel are suitable for primary care. I then send it to him, and he narrows it down to 15 to 20 of the top articles. That
yes.
forms a basis, and then I summarize it. And oh no, I don't. I ask the LLM to summarize it, and then I stick it into a WordPress site, and then he says it for him. He says it's brilliant because he can read all the important stuff in 10 minutes. He can just, as you say, he can just browse it and he can feel very confident. If he finds the summary useful and entices him, he will click on the link if he wants to read the full text or whatever is available at the URL. It might just be the abstract.
Mm,
So I think again, it's a good idea. It's got to be implemented well, and that's our job. And if it's not implemented well and it doesn't meet with our users' needs, it will fall by the wayside. Like these things happen, and you can't take it personally. You've got to try.
yes. Actually, your explanation reminded me of another service that I need to put you in touch with Thomas Critchell, the guy behind Repec, and he actually created a service similar to that I'm using. It's called BIMS, BIMS,
I
and there
think
might
I
be a
think I'm
way.
on that list as well, actually.
Yes, I think there is a way that Trip could collaborate with BIMS. But anyway, that is conversation for another time. But there is one. Well, this is a two-part question. The first part is that you are doing a lot of experiments with Trip, and you openly share it in your blog. And I've been following your blog for I think 2006 or seven something.
Hmm.
And so you've experimented with rapid review, meta-analysis of RCTs with placebo control group without access to full text, just based on the abstract. And then you've done trip tiles, you've used folksonomy, star rating, scoring, mashup, multilingual interface, and tilt. Today I learned that. So, two questions. First is that aren't you worried about doing these experiments that users may see it as an experimental platform, that things are coming and going, and it may, uh, what we have is a change fatigue, that user may say that it's too much, it's too many changes, I cannot take it. Um, that's the first part of question, that are you not worried about the users doing this experiment? And second thing is that what happens to these experiments? Because some of them were, I think, they were great and they just disappeared.
Firstly, a lot of the ones you mentioned, I use the blog as a platform to share my thoughts. So if I mention that folksonomy. We never actually implemented that. I often will just put a blog post out there and see if there's any reaction. And, I get emails saying, John, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Or people will say that's a really good idea. And so over half the things, well, probably 80% of the things I mentioned in the blog never come to fruition because there isn't the demand for it. Tilt, today I learned that. This was my best idea. I still think it's the best idea I've ever had because what we saw, we had well, Tilt was an idea is you'd read a paper, a document, a health professional, and we did this properly. We had a group of doctors doing it, dentists and nurses, and the idea was as they went through their day, they'd record what they'd learned that was clinically important. And so you'd read a paper, say if you just read the abstract, the background they knew, the methods they cared about a bit, but ultimately they would distill that abstract down to one or two key sentences of high quality learning, nuggets of knowledge. And as we were doing the pilot, it was going very, very well. Lots of these tilts today. I learned that X is bad for you, Y is good for you in this scenario, that. And I was very, very excited by it. But then we implemented it really badly. We created again, it took years for me to reflect on why it failed because we didn't I think there's two things. We implemented it badly and we didn't communicate it well enough to our users. For starters, we put it on a separate website. So what do you have? You have a website, trip database with hundreds of thousands of users a month. Do you put it on there or do you put it on a website that has no traffic? And it's easy in hindsight to say we should have integrated it better with Trip. We didn't. So the traffic was always going to be a problem. It comes back to the old comment I made earlier that about busy health professionals, they will only bookmark certain things. And if yours isn't a compelling, so they might have bookmarked Trip, but they certainly weren't bookmarking Tilt. But if we'd integrated Tilt better into Trip, it would have been probably more likely to succeed. And so that's just a lesson. And so some of the other things that we've had that fall by the wayside, when we were part of K Connect, we had multilingual search, which was pretty good. But again, it wasn't widely used. And when we took it away, because again, we go back to sustainability, it wasn't cheap to do. No one moaned. That's often a very good feedback for me, is if we change something, how many emails do I get from people unhappy? And it's surprising, some features you think, well, we'll retire it and no one will notice, and people notice. And then other times that, you think, oh, this is going to be a nightmare and doesn't register. And so again, this is the connection with our users that we've got, which I enjoy, is they are very, because I think I'm moderately approachable. And I think people know me because I've been around for so long that they seem more than happy to let me know what they're thinking, positive or negative. And, I thrive on that because it's, we can, because we're so small, we can respond. And I think that's another thing which our users like is how responsive we are.
Yes, I think if you create a corporate structure with an email for customer services with no phone number, which many do, I think that would I think now people think working with you and Trip like a community. They don't look at Trip as a corporate structure. And I think that is one of the reasons that they still fill in the surveys that you are sending. Because I receive surveys right and left. I don't touch them.
Mm,
So you could see that is a major effect. So people see you as part of the evidence synthesis community, not some corporate with MBA degree from, I don't know, Harvard
mm.
somewhere that's sitting behind the scenes. No one knows their name, and you cannot communicate with them. It's a good point actually. Have you ever been to court or threatened to go to court because of the copyright? Because many people think that Trip is great, and they are doing something behind the scene with the copyrighted content or something. I don't think it is an issue, but have you been ever threatened to go to court for doing something with some other people's content or something like that?
No, there was. I don't think we breached copyright. Because we don't reproduce the content. It'd be interesting if we start going down the RAG route. That
Yes.
sort of thing. There is the potential there, but I suppose when we were doing the Q&A work, we would get a question, we would answer it, and the answer would be so. We found four randomized controlled trials that addressed your question, and this is a summary of them. So one paragraph. So each there'd be a paragraph would be a summary for each randomized controlled trial, and we were reproducing the content. And no one ever bothered us about the copyright then. And I think there's this thing, I still fall behind this notion of fair use,
Yes.
and I'm also of the view it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And as I say, I don't think I genuinely don't think we have any issues that affect us with copyright. Obviously, in the future, with LLMs, there's an issue about that. But then what you have is if a copyright holder company wanted to take action, not about trip because we wouldn't get in that situation, but ultimately people like Google and the big players in this would be very much part of the defense because they don't want case law made on that would affect them. It has implications for them. So as I say, I don't
Yes.
think that would have impact on Trip, but the big players who are exploiting or more in a position to exploit copyright and to you see them all the time being was it the New York Times trying to stop Google or Facebook or so there's always trying to control their content and they end up in court for years and years and it's like I just don't think we'd register relative to the abuse that I think they see people like Facebook or whatever do or Google do with a lot of their content. So I think we don't do anything dodgy, I don't believe, with copyright, not at the moment, for sure, because we are small. But also, I do think that the worries are, I fall back on fair use.
Mm. But when it comes to the using large language models and RAG, at the main excuse is that I think some of the automation tools right now are using them. So they say that when we are using a PDF, we make sure that the model is not using that PDF or document for training. And the second thing that they do is that rather than using the PDF, they create the mathematical representation of each word in those documents and then play with those mathematical representations. So this is that we actually don't do anything with your file. We are just playing with the mathematics that we've got. So that's how they are going around this copyright.
Well, they'll be the one in courts, not me, hopefully. Touch wood. But if you take something like RAG, if you take RAG approach, in a way, the training of the document is the training of this of the model is separate from because you're training the model to understand
It
the
is the active
context.
learning part. So with
But
each document fed into the system, if we could stop the machine from learning from the new documents and only rely on the previous learning, they say that is okay actually.
yeah, but for instance, we're playing around with Chat GPT and
Mhm.
Llama 3, standalone. So there's no feedback to the main Chat GPT or well, Llama 3 standalone, should I say? Chat GPT. Chat GPT invariably has the content we use anyway, because all the content we use is available on the web. It's not as though we're not using behind a paywall material. So again, it's with the RAG, you you get it, you only get the LM to summarize documents that are freely available on the web. So to me, that's still fair use.
Mm. So actually on that, on the web, we've got a lot of open access documents either gold open access, green open access, diamond open access, and there are great sources that provides this great list of documents, database of documents. We've got OpenAlex, which is mainly title abstract, but we've core.ac.uk, and with encouragement of researchers, medical researchers, to go toward open access, we expect to see more and more full text. And based on that, I mean, we've got core, we've got medRx, we've got clinicaltrials.gov, WHICTRP, OpenAlex, and more. And is TRIP going to use any of these sources? Because I know there are people dying to find an alternative to searching these sources, including clinicaltrials.gov. They want to search another source and get, let's say, RIS file out with all the content.
Well, we use OpenAlex. We include the clinicaltrials.gov content in TRIP. That's you do a search and you can restrict to ongoing clinical trials. medRxiv, we don't typically use. But again, if you go back to the start of this, near the start of our conversation, we're quality, not quantity. And we could include all of PubMed. We don't want to. We could include medRxiv, but we don't want to. Uh, so again, so there's that aspect. It's easy to add stuff, but when you add stuff, you add noise, and it's we if someone flags up, we get regular, we search ourselves for new source of content, but also people will email saying, oh, well, Trip should link to this. Then we have to take a view of it's often not often, but sometimes it's someone who's my paper's just been published in this journal. Can you index this journal? And so I'm thinking, nah, it really doesn't work like that. But we have a process whereby we look at the content, we look at the methodology, and we say, how would this improve TRIP? And if you ask about medRxiv, I think that would add more poor quality content. Peer review is terrible, but it's better than no peer review, which is medRxiv. And and so you think from the quality thing, there's no way you can even begin to believe that medRxiv stuff is reasonable. You've got to go through it and appraise it and believe what's been written. So I think medRxiv is really problematic. And then some of the other sources, again, what's our core use case? Will it help? OpenAlex, we use OpenAlex and Unpaywall, which is they're part of the same group. So we use that for full text link outs. So about over 70% of our journal articles link out to full text for pro users because Unpaywall is great. We also search for systematic reviews using a filter for OpenAlex to find ones which aren't in PubMed. And so that's why we've got such probably the largest collection of systematic reviews, searchable systematic reviews out there.
All of these are title and abstract bibliographic records. You don't get into the full text at all. So TRIP does not search full text or does anything based on the full text.
Well, it's variable because if we get a document from OpenAlex, it'll be full text. And so we will index the full text. If it's an abstract in PubMed, we will only grab the abstract, and so you search the abstract.
How about PubMed Central?
Oh yeah, that's included in. If we don't include all of PubMed Central, but as part of our full text link out, we will do a DOI lookup. I think that's how we manage it with. That's certainly how we manage it with Unpaywall, where we have an abstract. So we include about 600 the abstracts from 600 core journals in PubMed. So just over 10% of PubMed articles, we'll grab all their abstracts. And then each one of those, we will see if there's a full text in either PubMed Central, or if not PubMed Central, we'll then say is there an OpenAlex, or sorry, an Unpaywall link out to the full text, in which case we include that as well. We don't index it in that via that route. We only index the abstract if it's there. But if the sort of we index, then look for full text. So it's post-indexing that we look for the full text. So we don't.
Mhm.
I'm not convinced it's a good idea to index the full text for what we need it for. But I think in some situations it's probably useful.
So that is, you remember, I think 3 years ago that I was presenting something about search pyramid, and I said that top of the pyramid is going to be the system that answers the question, but then it shows you where the answer came from with the data, with the link to the evidence. So I think in the future, more and more people are going to go for the conversational search, asking from their phone their clinical question, and they would want the answer. And for that answer, I think title and abstract would not be enough. And they would want to get, so to have a better answer, you need to have access to the full text.
I'm going to push back there. I think not. I
Why not?
think well, but I don't because again, you're not a clinician. You're not a health professional. So I think there's a sort of a thing about you're coming at it from a different perspective than an active physician, and I think there's a that's important. We when we were doing clinical question answering, we used to use the abstract. We used to be very clear. If there's a guideline, so say we went to PubMed, we'd say this answer is based on the abstract. But what we said to we answered over 5,000 clinical questions in Wales. We in total we've answered over 10,000 because we included England as well. We were very open in saying if you want any full text article, we will get it for you. We never ever got asked for the full text article. Never once in 5,000, 10,000 clinical questions because there is it's try you need to understand the end user and what they are. They are time poor
Yes.
and
Do you have this
it,
published somewhere? Because that's important information.
no,
So it is
I
not
don't write
public
papers.
knowledge.
I don't write. If I wrote it, it would have been in the blog. I don't think I would have
Mm.
written it in the blog. Someone said to me about why don't you write more papers? I said, well, I don't want to be ignored.
No, I
It's
think that is a very nice statistics if we could, because
I've got loads of
with
stats like
that
that.
we could cure cancer with what you said, because most of the sources that we've got, information sources, we need to subscribe to them, and we pay billions globally. The libraries are paying billions to get access to this full text. If we could get clinical answers without having access to the full text, actually, do we need to get subscribed to many of these sources for the clinical purpose? Systematic review is different, but for the clinical purpose, do we actually need to get subscription to many of these sources?
I think there's a balance. I think there's, I think I remember one of the key sources we had, if we had a clinical question asked by a GP, would be Prodigy, now known as CKS. Uh, their guidelines were great. And I remember saying years ago, I know it sounds really naff, but I said that we need to take a pair of HTML scissors to these documents because they're big, long documents. And they were unwieldy. They were sort of tens of pages long, and people didn't have the. We talk about point of care, and again, we could go back to the question answering. There's different types. There's point of care question answering, and there's ones that you do actually remember and you go back to and you look at. There's a distinction there. But Prodigy were great, and they are still great, but they were a bit unwieldy, especially back 20, 30 years ago. And so the notion of if you cut them up into smaller bits would have been useful. But they weren't in a format where the doctors were comfortable browsing them. So they just used to send the question to us and we used to do the browsing for them. So it was, but similarly, if you found, I remember there's one about does wearing school satchels over one shoulder cause neck pain or back pain? I forget. We found about
Mm.
30 papers, 99% of them said yes. And you think, well, you don't need the full text. You really don't. You don't need to do a systematic review. If 99% of the documents say, of articles say it causes back pain, you can be fairly confident that's true. And, so but again, it's a
Yeah,
use
I don't think
case.
many people would go with that. Just 99% of the papers. What about the ones that are not published? What about the risk of bias, the quality of the
But
studies
again,
can?
you're talking from an ivory tower here.
Yeah.
You should go and spend some time sitting down with some busy clinicians,
Oh, I
understanding
have.
that.
I
Yeah,
was a
but
clinical
how
librarian.
many of those asked you to get a full text paper, and how many are
None
asking them
of
to help?
them, none of them, but all of
Okay,
them
well,
asked for the
sorry.
source. Yeah, all of them asked for the
Wait,
source. Where did you get this? And I was giving the citation or the document. But yeah, you're right. They didn't ask, and I was actually in emergency department, so there was a time issue there. But it
but I think
doesn't
this
negate
is the
the.
thing. But this is the thing. I think this is my privileged position, but also it's a my position is I grew up professionally at the cold face of general practice in a way, answering the clinical question and understanding the GPs and their demands. I mean, it could well have changed by now, but that's led me to believe. I remember talking to an academic at Oxford because I'm affiliated there, the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, and he was exasperated that the doctors weren't critically appraising. I said they haven't got time to critically appraise documents. And he
That's
was saying,
true.
well, they should. I said, you can say should all you'd like, but they're not going to. And so what you've got is it's this notion of in an ideal world, a doctor would see one patient a month. They would look at their thing. They would get the 10 full text articles. They would do a systematic review to have a look at it, to summarize the documentation, do it properly. But it ain't going to happen. And we have to be pragmatic. And I suppose that's trip is pragmatic, which, I was banging on about rapid reviews for years. And before the rapid review blog, which I don't really contribute to anymore, it's pretty dormant. The amount of grief I got from systematic reviewers saying what I do was immoral or similar was quite staggering. And what I find quite amusing is a lot of them now are now doing them. And you think, well, how have you changed? And cynically, I could say, well, the money's there now to do rapid reviews, and you suddenly had a conversion because the money's there. And it's like I could be being cynical, but the methodological issues of rapid reviews haven't changed anything from the systematic review.
Rapid review actually is on the systematic review that you involve more resources to do it fast. It is not like shortcutting. So the worry is that
Well,
the
no, we're
evidence.
going to get we're going to fall out about this. We're going to disagree.
Well, let's disagree on that. But the reason that I think many people wouldn't like the approach is that it may become the gold standard for any clinical question. So if I take your approach that if 99% of papers says that um, yeah, wearing your backpack from one side of your body is gonna cause
Yeah.
pain, then we take it as the answer, then people would stop gradually, would stop doing any sort of evidence synthesis for anything. They would just look at what the majority, and then that would mean that if I could publish 10 papers about something supporting my medicine, people would take it. So that is the danger there, that there is a time that you don't have any time. You need a rapid answer, and any answer is better than nothing. And then there is a time that we actually are not sure by just looking at 10, even if 90% are saying that it is going to
Okay.
cause pain.
I'm not advocating what's known as vote counting, but what I am saying is that if you are a health professional with a clinical uncertainty
Mhm.
and there is no systematic review, are you saying they should do nothing? I remember having a conversation with someone, uh, an information specialist. This was in Wales, and they were upset with me for doing this Q&A service. And I said, you fund them to have PubMed or Medline, sorry. You know they'll use it. badly, or there's a high likelihood they will use it badly. So why is that ethically superior to me answering their questions for them? And it's so ask the question to you. You're a busy health. Imagine you're a busy health professional. You have a clinical uncertainty. You've gone to trip, say, and you can't find a systematic review or a clinical guideline. What do you do?
Would usually go for the next level, which is a randomized control trial, and I would take it if it is published in one of the top journals.
But only one? What happens if there's,
Yeah. The thing is that if you are a busy clinician, you would go for one and you would trust if it is coming, let's say with American, if it is in JAMA, if it is in AHA, then you would probably
that's
take
a
it.
terrible heuristic though, isn't it? Because
But that is
you're
what they've done. I've seen that they are doing
yeah,
that.
no, but this is where we get to the sort of the nub of it of it's fine if you've got 6 months and loads of money to do a systematic review. If your patient is bleeding out, you haven't got that luxury.
Yes.
Or if you're pay, and so this is where my pragmatism comes from, is this realization that that people have uncertainties. What's the best way of doing it? And you could say, well, we could let the doctors or nurses search for themselves, which is not unreasonable, but they're more likely to get a biased sample of of articles that support their prior belief. Two great examples uh, from my time answering clinical questions. One GP said, "I can search Medline and get any answer I want." That was one question. I mean, one response, because he knew that what he wanted to find evidence to support his prior understanding, what his prior belief. Another one was this was going back, it was topical non-steroidals for, I think it's,
Eczema?
sorry.
Is it eczema?
No, it was a topical non-steroidal for elbow pain. I think
Okay.
it was. And I found five randomized control trials. Four said it was useful. One said it was not useful. I saw him a few months later. I said, "Oh, how did you get on with that question?" He said, "I binned the four articles that were in favor and shared the one paper which was negative with my colleagues." And this is the
Why?
because he had this belief that they were not effective and he wasn't being evidence based, he was
Well,
being biased. And
so
so
yeah,
what you
it is the confirmation bias in search. It's the same
absolutely
thing with any search engine. If you ask Google milk is bad, it will give you 10 reasons it is bad. If you say milk is good, it will. So we shouldn't go with the assumption.
but again, I remember we did the game, this was never written up, that I'll ask you the question. We answered, well, all the Q&A servers have answered to over 10,000 clinical questions. We did a survey once of how often secondary evidence was able to answer a clinical question. So secondary evidence was clinical guidelines or systematic reviews. How many of the clinical questions that were received from health professionals, coalface, were answerable by those sources?
Ah, I see what you mean.
100%, 50%, 1%,
No, it's gonna be 10% max.
20%.
Well, that's good.
Systematic reviews were about 1%.
Well, yeah, it makes sense.
Systematic reviews, systematic reviews are academically beautiful, I'm sure. They're boring and they're not clinically useful, is my contention. And this is me. We're going away from trip now. We're going now to my perspective here, is that of all the questions that doctors and nurses have, systematic reviews are not great at answering them. And there's a disconnect there, and that's an
So,
interesting one.
yes, that's why in clinical practice, we try to educate people rather than telling them the search skills, or we just tell them the sources. And they usually start from the top of the pyramid of six S's. And they start with the summary of the evidence, start with clinical practice guide, they start with up to date and clinical key and all these apps that have the summary of the guidelines. They usually do. And if they couldn't find their question, then they move down, and then they would come to TRIP database or PubMed or whatever source that they have. So, and I agree that we don't have a comprehensive source that have majority of the clinical questions, so they have to make pragmatic decision.
But again, that's the principle of TRIP, is making the best available evidence to answer the clinical question. So if there isn't secondary evidence, you go down the pyramid and you might find a randomized controlled trial. But going back to that issue of any user, and we go back to confirmation bias, all the inherent biases that are there from information seeking behavior, and that's the beauty of having an information specialist who is more likely to be unbiased than, say, the health professional. Is if you allow someone to, say you search Medline, so take it away from TRIP. Say you say it's Medline. Medline doesn't have all the content in there, and your heuristic. Well, if it's in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, it's more likely to be right than if it's in well, I don't know, a lesser journal, which won't know any of the lesser journals. It's probably going to get more scrutiny from people, I suppose, if it's there, but not that the user would, searching Medline or PubMed, would see that. I think it's a very difficult one. I remember one of the arguments I used to worry that when we were answering clinical questions that we weren't doing a systematic review and therefore we might give them incorrect information. And what I did was I had a line. This is how, I'm making sure I got it the right one. So this was a systematic review. So this is a scale from 0 to 100% with a systematic review. Nowadays, I wouldn't have a systematic review at 100%, but I was young and naive in those days. And I used to think, okay, our Q&A might get this far fairly close to systematic review quality, not quite. But a health professional doing it themselves will probably be much further away than the systematic review than we could get because of biases and not being as good at searching and things like that. And so I didn't say, that's how I was comfortable doing what we were doing with the view that we're probably better than a busy health professional would be in generating an answer to their own clinical question. And that was the justification. I think, and again, it's this pragmatism, the idealism is fine, but ultimately, if you're a health professional, you have a clinical question, the biggest source of question answering for health professionals is asking their colleague. I suspect that's prone to bias as well.
I
So
agree.
I think it's a very complicated. There's no, one can't be black and white about this. And I think there's
Yeah.
nuance. I'm not saying I'm right about it, but all I know, it's murky, and you can't do a systematic view for every clinical question.
It is multiple approaches to the search. That's why we do have clinical librarians who are doing what you just mentioned. So this is what they do when there is no systematic review. And we do have multiple approaches to search, and then we have different approaches to search depending on users' skills as well. So if they are not skilled, they probably would take the first document on top without looking at the risk of bias, without looking at what the journal is, without looking at if it is a journal paper that is actually a clinical practice guideline published in a journal. So that all depends. So I agree that it's not just one size fits all, and majority of it is pragmatic decision making. When you are in busy clinical environment, it is it is easy for me to sit behind my desk and tell people what to do, not to do. And in the real world, it is completely different.
But again, swinging it around, to work we're doing at the moment, and we've had emails about this, about using LLMs to score systematic reviews. And
Yeah,
because I'm very worried, because we introduced a guideline score, which not using LLMs, because you have this notion of evidence pyramid, but as you know, you can have a really bad systematic review.
yeah.
But if we put systematic reviews on a pedestal, say, or a clinical guideline, because they're secondary evidence, I think it's very I am uncomfortable that our users might say, oh, TRIP has labeled this green. It's a systematic review, therefore we can trust it. And that makes me very uncomfortable. And
Well, add a
hence the need for,
disclaimer. Add a disclaimer. Why don't you add a
oh,
disclaimer?
well, yeah, we could do something like that. Or whether it's
Mhm.
red. I think an easy that's something we could do, that's for sure. We can use LLMs to look for hints if a systematic review is good or bad. Again, it's
Yes.
pragmatic. It's this term I hide behind all the time. I'm being pragmatic.
You need two disclaimers then. One for the fact that you're providing medical information, you shouldn't be responsible for the consequences of using that information. The second one for using large language models, and they may hallucinate sometime. So, I mean, you just
Hang
put the
on.
responsibility on the
I'm
user's
I'm I'm
shoulder.
I'm going to push back on you. What's the error rate for LLMs compared with humans?
Um,
Has
I
anyone ever
don't
done that?
know. I
Because
think, well, yes, there are actually research in systematic review, not specifically for the answering clinical questions, but I think there are ways to evaluate it. And we were actually in Search Solutions, they were discussing about the ways to evaluate and measure the hallucination. I don't
well, the
think it's done
hallucination
like
rate's
that.
really low. It's over. I think it's getting lower. And I saw a paper recently. I think it was about systematic review production where they used two independent LLMs.
Yes, that was from Mayo Clinic. It was on medRxiv preprint. Yes,
And it was like if they both agreed, you took it as true. If they disagreed, you took it to a human to adjudicate, which to me was
yes.
brilliant. And I think there were ways of overcoming. And again, if you think the explosion of LLMs in the last is it 18 months, 2 years? If you think where are we going to be in another 3 years' time,
Yeah, with the current resistance and the media, and you would imagine that media is against it because it is against media. If large language model becomes the thing, people would go for news, for everything, for so you would think that media is against it, and many people would take time for them to get the acceptance. Right now, people are using non-touch phones still. So you can imagine that it's going to take a very long time for people to accept it, especially that they are worried about losing their jobs. But for the specific use, and if we could implement RAG, I think, and it has, I mean, there are ways like they are using knowledge graphs and implementing like what they call it safety RAG that reduces the hallucination to a level that is ignorable. But the evaluation is ongoing, so we couldn't actually say that they are better than human.
well, we're doing lots of stuff in the background using RAG for Q&A and stuff like that, and we're getting really good results. But we're not looking at enough to necessarily notice any big hallucinations. So it's a scale thing, I guess, as well.
Yeah,
What is it about? I read it's about 2% hallucination rate, but that's for general LLMs, not necessarily RAG. And I'm not sure what the
exactly.
hallucination rates are for RAG.
Exactly. So I'm very hopeful, and you might have seen in my previous sessions that I've said that I have also have high hopes for the RAG, and it is going to be game changing, I think, and it is going to be the part that we finally could use large language models in our daily practice. So yeah, we need to wait to see how the evaluations
But
are going to support this.
but also what you need is people like Trip who are prepared to go out on a limb to experiment. I think you need people to agitate in the space. You need people to push the boundaries, and for for others to see the so rapid reviews. As I say, I mentioned rapid reviews. I started the blog. I was shouted down for years about rapid reviews, and now everyone, not everyone, but they're widely embraced. I'm not saying that's down to me, but what I'm saying is I was part of a process of moving, of asking the questions, I guess, and creating a bit of churn in the otherwise very safe and conservative world of systematic reviews. And I think you need people who can agitate. And there's lots of startups at the moment in the LLM space who are doing some wonderful things, wonderfully clever things. Whether they're sustainable is a completely different question. But you always need people who are going to challenge the existing systems because that's how you make progress, or one of the ways you make progress. And Trip causes does stuff which might be a bit stupid at times, but again, it helps because people can, you know, it can help even if it gives people something to push back on, and it's, well, we can't possibly do this because of the following reasons. But at least you ask the questions, I suppose. And it's, I quite like having that sort of the sort of grit in an oyster. So, to an extent.
Yes, I think I'm not going to disagree on that, because I agree with it. I mean, I have nothing to say other than sometimes you need to give that push and be disruptive and radical until people come to their senses and realize that actually. So that is what I always tell people when they say that automation is going to replace it. I say that if it is going to generate an evidence or find a medication that is going to save uh, my family members who are suffering from certain conditions to live longer, to live happier, I'm happy to live on this street, lose my
Mm.
job, because that is an ethical challenge. So I shouldn't hug my job and let people die because I want to have a job. So if there is a way that we could get the evidence faster and save many lives and save lots of pain, I mean, this has happened before. Machines came, people lost their jobs, and then the same machines created lots of other jobs. So that is something that I tell people to embrace this new change, try to understand it as much as they can, and try to educate themselves about the new technology, and then try to use it in your daily use. It doesn't have to be like 8 hours of use. You could use 5 minutes a day and
Mm.
learn and see how you could implement it, and you will start trusting them gradually.
I think as I say with Trip, we've spent an awful lot of time with LLMs, understanding where they can be useful. We could have had a product out in 6 months ago, but it just wasn't right. And we're having to understand them better. And I don't want to rush it. There's no commercial pressure to rush it. And so, we'll invariably 2025 we'll introduce, I predict, we'll start introducing LLM based products. Still don't know what they'll be. There's lots of potential routes we could go, but part of it is sort of understanding it and being comfortable with it, and knowing that it's not a threat. It's how can you take advantage of the opportunity. And so for us, we're not rushing. And again, I think you're right. People should learn to understand it, take time, not be put off by it, understand the potential, and they can help an awful. I'm sure they're going to be it's going to be game changing for an awful lot of people. And they ain't going to, if they work for the NHS, they're not going to lose their job. The NHS classically never gets rid of anybody. That's a
Oh
slightly different
God,
point,
oh
I
God.
guess.
I
But it's
mean, it was supposed to be an interview, but I knew that with you it is impossible. It turned into debate. I'm going to get back to the interview questions.
go on
Um,
then.
so have you considered collaborating with other technologies or tools that already exist in the market, like 2D search, or I just mentioned BIMs? Have you considered collaborating with other search tools or search, let's say, solutions in Trip?
I just punched the microphone. That wasn't very professional. I'm keen to collaborate with anyone who I feel can make Trip better, or I can contribute somehow to the betterment of society or whatever, however you want to frame it. But I think there's one thing I've learned is that so dealing with academia is a nightmare. So I struggle dealing with academia because they have different timelines. I've and there's lots of other reasons. So academia is always a difficult one. Uh, their outcomes are not necessarily always aligned with the outcomes of TRIP, shall we say. They seem to care about writing papers and things like that and not actually changing much. Is a broad, huge, sweeping statement, which I'm renowned for. But
I
yeah,
agree. Yes.
but the collaboration is it's difficult to get aligned with a collaborator in a way. And it could just because I'm not good at that sort of thing on a personal level. I think also it's because I'm very, very busy doing trip stuff. And so
Mm,
where's that time coming from? What am I not going to do? I'm going to start collaborating. But doing the
mm.
K Connect, that was a pan-European collaboration with a number of SMEs and academic centres. And that was stimulating. It produced some good stuff for Trip. Uh, and I often get emails from typically the States, asking about various, would I like to be involved? And I'll have lots of conversations. And nine times out of 10, they won't go anywhere. But, occasionally, because it doesn't suit them or it doesn't suit us, but occasionally we'll do it. So I'm always keen. It doesn't have to be commercially viable for me. It's got to be interesting for me. Again, coming back to the ego and side of things, but also I think it's got to align with what our users want. And I think it's very difficult to get that balance right.
You look at the users, what they want, and they may send you feedback on what they're interested to see in Trip. What is the next innovation that we should expect to see at Trip database? And who makes this decision? Is it because the user suggests it? Do you have a board? Do you have user testing group or advisory board that sit together and decide what innovation is going to be next?
It's an interesting one, but again, it's mostly me. And that's why you get a high failure rate, I suppose, these new ideas, because I take the blame and I'll take the credit. Uh, no, we have users who we regularly ask our users, and they will tell the problems that they are facing, in using Trip or are there other features. And so recently, we observe we look at the search logs occasionally. Again, it's search logs. Every time someone does a search on Trip, it's recorded. What documents they click on, it's recorded, and we, with some difficulty, can look at these search logs and try to understand our users. We don't do it very well, but we do it from time, and we notice that the top searches are asthma, hypertension, uh, myocardial infarction, single. And to me, as an information specialist, that's like, it's not a very good search, because it's like there's surely some intention behind you asking this. So we did a survey and saying, why are you doing such a basic search? I thought it was because we have problems formulating complex searches. No, they didn't. They said we can do that. Trip makes it really easy to do that. What they do is they do a very basic search, and what they want to do is get an idea of what is out there. What's a sort of like you mentioned scoping. It's like scoping the topic, and then they refine afterwards. And
Yes.
so for me, that becomes one of, okay, that's interesting. Can we now do? Is there a way we can support users to understand the search of, say, they did search for asthma? Can we do like a topic mapping for them? And so I just produced a blog last night, some things I do on doing a mind map. We took the top 300 articles for a search, a simple search. What was a search? I think it was prostate cancer. We did it and put 300. So this is how I did. I exported the 300 articles into a CSV. I took the titles, so 300 titles, created the prompt, which was something like uh, create a mind map. I saw it on Twitter. So essentially you can do it. I think it's called markup language. So do a mind map with subtopics and subtopics and create it in markup language. And so they did that. And then you went to this website, which is Markup or something like that. It's on the blog, I forget now. And they produce a lovely mind map, which is like you start off prostate cancer, you have diagnosis, then you have and you think, my God, I just looked at it. And again, I got really excited because I think this is brilliant.
Yes, it
But
is.
it's just me. Will the users like it? We will produce it as a beta and we will let our users look. Or no, well, we might not even go down that route, but this is a potential. So I've blogged about it. That's put the idea out there. We might produce it because I think it's relatively straightforward to do. We've got to decide whether it is, if our users want it. I like it. I think it solves a problem. Does it actually solve a problem? I'm not sure. And this is why we've got to test ourselves. And you said yourself earlier, you can't keep introducing new features because people will just switch off. And so it's that balance, isn't it? It's this is my responsibility to have the balance between rolling out new features which people may or may not want, which I think are a nice idea and meet a user need, but that's a skill or lack of it is actually doing it. And it's you've got to be prepared to fail.
I'm going to give you my honest opinion about the features that you've introduced. I think one side of you is into helping the clinicians, mainly primary care, but the other side of you is into evidence synthesis and systematic review. Majority of the features that you have introduced so far, and that's my personal opinion, one man's opinion, are very useful for evidence synthesis and systematic reviewers, but clinicians may not find them useful. And because the majority of your users are clinicians, it may not work in that context. Maybe you need to have another trick for evidence synthesis.
But again, I think there's a tension there. I don't think it's only systematic reviewers who are asking for topic mapping, for instance. Because I saw the mind maps as it's if you look at the blog, blog.tripdatabase.com, I could see that as being a search refinement. You could click on it. If someone does it, you could have it, like at the moment, you can filter by evidence
Yeah,
type, you can filter by clinical area. There's no reason why you couldn't use it. Oh, hang on, you can click on diagnosis, you could click on therapy, you could do focal
yeah,
therapy. It's a nice way of drilling down through the topics. And I think it could well be a very useful tool for that search refinement side of things. So I think
yeah.
it
It is a
is.
post-search filter. So you
I think it
filter
could be
after
used
search
like
result.
that.
Yeah. Mm.
Again, for people not knowing what the topic is about and wanting to drill down, it saves them having to type in, I'm actually interested in focal therapy. You just click on the focal therapy
Is it
link.
available right now?
Again,
Not
I just
yet.
produced it at the weekend, put it out there. If anyone likes it, we'll see what happens.
Okay, I'm interested to see because I thought that it's gonna be before the search, but it is apparently after you run the search and then you use it as a sort of filtering out
One
what you
could.
want. Yeah.
But again, I'm not trying to be evasive, but it is this thing about we're feeling our way slowly about using the power of LLMs, and this is another potential idea. And
Mhm.
ultimately, because even though Trip is mainly me, there's our long-standing techie. We've now got a more full-time techie, but the long-standing techie and me often battle about what's best for Trip. And it's very useful. I appreciate it. So I wanted to create something called a search assistant, where people would call the topic map, they would call document summarization, they would call the various re-ranking the results using various things. Uh, he thinks we're missing a trick, and he thinks that we should have it more embedded in Trip. So, for instance, someone does a search and they click on one document, you could automatically, well, two documents is better. You can use the LLM to re-rank. So the prompt is something like a user did a search for prostate cancer. They clicked on these two documents, and here's the remaining 300 results. Based on what you know from their clicks, re-rank the other 298 articles, and it does a pretty good job. And you think, okay, you could semi-automate that. You could do it so you in the background, you just pop up a modal saying, "Oh yeah, you've clicked on these two documents. Uh, do you want us to reorder the results to make it more useful?" So that's his view. You should make it more in people's face. And my view is people need to call it. And this is a battle we'll have. And, you
Yes,
know,
it's there's it's always two sides of the coin. So I think both of them are valid, and if there is a way to implement both of them, that will be great. And is there anything blocking the progress of Trip database?
money.
Just money?
Well, well, it's resource. We are hampered by not enough technical web people. Uh, that's the biggest blockage. Ideally, I would like to, we've spent very little over the years on any form of marketing. And people say, "Oh, we didn't know Trip existed." That's because we don't have the resources of some of the, of the bigger organizations. And so I think that holds us back to some extent being more widely known because it's a niche product. EBM is still niche, no matter how much we wish it wasn't. And so developing Trip as a product, I suppose it's lack of technical, having the techies to do the hard work. I'm sure it will benefit from a wider user group who are engaged and remunerated to help make Trip better. But I think also it's about getting the message that Trip exists out there as well. Even though it's been around for 20 odd years, as I say, it's a niche product.
It's a good point. And so this is coming to the question of, well, it's going to be a bit controversial. Did you make Trip database free during the pandemic? So that is one part of the question. The second part is that there are countries in the world who cannot pay. So 350 million people in the world are living under economic sanctions. There are a lot of low and middle income countries who cannot afford to pay. And I know that Trip is cheap for someone who lives in G7, let's say. They could afford to get subscription.
Yeah.
But how about those who are in need and cannot afford it? And how about in situations such as pandemic?
First bit, COVID. No, we didn't make it free. The reason is because I didn't consider it and no one asked. Because I was doing a lot of work with Oxford, and it was a very stressful, very. I didn't spend much time with Trip at that time, and so it never crossed my mind to. I'd have had no problem doing so, but I just didn't think, and that was again a problem. It was just a bit reliant on me. As for working with lower income countries, uh, or resource poor, I think is we are happy to make it freely available to, they have the World Bank ratings for countries. So for the lowest bands, Trip can be made available free to them. And for ones in the next band, I forget the exact banding, we're happy to offer a very good discount. We want Trip to be used. So we're working with a number of groups to making it freely available to a number of African universities, for instance, there's probably about 8 or 9 countries in Africa, their universities. But again, part of it is, we were approached, I think it was a South American country saying we can't afford your prices, again, for the reasons you were outlining. And so we said, okay, how does this feel? And we gave them like a 95%, 90% discount, 80% discount. I forget exactly. And so we're happy. We want Trip to be used. If they want to use Trip, we don't want it to be that money is not allowed, is getting in the way of them using Trip. And so, we need money. Obviously, the G7 or whatever, they've got more money available, arguably. And and so I'm happy for them effectively to subsidize access to the resource poorer parts of the world. But they need to let me know if you know people and they email saying this, that, or the other. I want Trip to be used. That's ultimately. And so if it's for free, for the really poorer countries, I'll be delighted.
That's a perfect answer. Thank you, John, on behalf of everyone who lives in those situations or countries. And do we expect any surprises from Trip during this year? So you mentioned mind map and you are doing stuff behind the scenes with the LLMs.
There will be surprises, but I don't know what they are yet because because we've got lots of things, we've got lots of plates spinning, and we don't know which ones we'll deliver on. So I can't say for certain. Genuinely, I can't. All I know is the surprises will revolve around LLMs. What the actual surprises will be, it could be one of one, two, three of 10 things. I genuinely, that's as honest as I can be because I just genuinely don't know. It's really exciting, but obviously it's frustrating as well because I want certainty, but I'm just enjoying having fun behind the scenes playing around with these technologies. So all I can say next year, LLMs probably something well considered. But what that will be, I don't know.
Great. It's very, yeah, it was technical part. I think it was very useful. I think many people would enjoy to know all the developments that has happened to Trip during these years, and it's long actually. I cannot imagine that it has been for so long we have had Trip. And when people ask me about the resources, there are usually 3, 4 EBM resources that I introduce, and Trip always comes on top of them. So thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. And we are approaching the end of the interview, and it usually starts with something that we are worried in the field of evidence-based medicine, and that is the leadership crisis. We have had great leaders in our field, and when they retire or they leave, usually the group that they were leading start dissolving, or they no longer perform as they used to. So I want to ask you, why do you think we have this crisis, and what's going to happen to Trip if you decide to retire or leave?
Uh, firstly, I don't believe there is a crisis. Uh, I see enough people who are incredibly bright, incredibly charismatic, and incredibly engaging who are carrying on from the light. People like Dave Sackett's obviously died. People like Muir Gray is getting on a bit, and people like Ian Chalmers. Ian Chalmers is sort of virtually retired as far as I can tell. I think he still keeps his eye on a bit. So they've left, but then you've got I know Paul Glasgow. I think Paul Glasgow, who was leader of Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine, I know again, I think he's coming to the end of I think he's retiring in some form. But then you've got people like Carl Hennigan. He's still, he's roughly my age, so there's still a bit of life left in him. But then you go again, I'm not massively switched on or plugged into the EBM world. So a lot of my knowledge is from liaising with the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford. And there is a huge number of people there who are incredibly bright. They might not have the profile, but when Carl retires, for instance, there'll be a new leader of the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine, and they will be equally adept. And I think I think it's the same that I think I'm not worried about, you need, again, is when you get too long in the tooth, you need to let the youngsters come up with their enthusiasm and their ideas. And I think I don't sense as a crisis. I think there are certain people who are not getting the answer they want from evidence-based medicine, so try to create an alternative view of evidence-based medicine. But I don't think anyone takes that particularly seriously. So I'm not I don't sense this crisis in EBM. But perhaps I'm
How
just
about
an
Trip?
optimist.
How about Trip? You multiple times you mentioned that you are the only full-time employee since the inception.
I genuinely don't know what's going to happen to Trip. I I still love doing what I do, so there's no reason for me to hang up. But I appreciate I'm not immortal, and therefore I will die, and
Thinking about
therefore,
Godfather,
sorry.
any godparents for Trip?
Well, but but part of it is a serious question. There needs to be some sort of notion of what will happen to Trip, and it might get buried with me. I don't know. The thing is, what are the options? We get bought out. We occasionally get approached, but it never works out. Do I retire it? Do I just say it will cease operating in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, whatever? I don't like that idea. But there's no, I've got to start giving this some serious thought before I go completely senile. And it's that thing it's got to be considered, but at the moment I've got no sensible answers to it.
And if I want to repeat this interview, in how many years we should have that interview?
3 to 5.
So that's gonna be the great changes to Trip then. Do you have any leadership lessons for young generations, and or anything else that you want to share with the audience?
I have survived because I care about what I'm doing. And if you find something you care about, you are prepared to put the effort in, and you are more likely to make it a success. And the other thing is, you've got to be prepared to fail. Uh, I always like to think if you don't fail, you're not trying hard enough, because you've got to push the boundaries. You've got to be prepared to make errors, because you learn from them. If if you keep getting things right and people saying, "Oh, what you're doing is great," it's really bad for you. You really notice you really need to mess up from time to time for people to keep you grounded, and so you learn as a process. Why did I fail? So tilt, brilliant idea. Why did it fail? Because John was an idiot and how he implemented it. Lesson learned. So fail and learn and care. That's about it.
Thank you. They were, I mean, you just summarized it better than any LLM in 3 words. John, you have been very generous with your knowledge, with your time, and on behalf of evidence-based medicine, evidence synthesis community, I want to thank you for sharing a lot of amazing information with all of us. And I'm sure myself and many others wish you and the TRIP database all the best. We hope to speak to you soon. Thank you, John, and goodbye.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.